Well, Tashidale, it's wonderful to be back with you this morning and to see all of you, to Professor Gerardo, and we're very excited to begin the second portion of the research webinar for the summer workshop. And Nicole, if you want to advance the slide. So you'll recall that one of the things that we introduced last time was a method of collecting data for a particular research study. Dawa, you're translating?
Yes.
Okay. So I was just, yeah, go ahead.
심지기 콘센트라트 람진요들라 아니 제수 상만제비 제와타 양실 헤트발라 가우시우치 존스 네테랑아츠 데시자야티 다 지거리 데시자레스나 단다 아니 개성아츠 지지바르완 전다 땅포 값이 지난주 지지바르와땡아츠 네지 땅투 간다스 드르치구레사티 타블렌치 모트지스.
And the goal of this portion of ETSI is to help provide you with skills so that you can examine questions that interest you using methods of research.
lakchachi kotochi de ne chetsungo ne susugi shindo pig drawa de la ya lens hair larwa lens hair ge resta susugi dindo pig drawa de la lens hair ge ani lakcha chi kotochi de res.
And there are many components of doing a research study, one of which is coming up with a question, another is coming up with a method of examining that question, and a final is coming up with a method of analyzing the data from that particular experiment.
ko ceruk shinjik thabna imbaina ko tampotela karayore system balaya drawaching digorwa drawaching riati ko chiguyores nyuatila ya drawatila len zeyagi thalam ti joschiatire thalwen teres ta sambatila ya tinda chiyo paina ani thamatela ya ta drawati len chele len rajo tela ya ani te ko karsuguranga suge hiship kanders du chigures te thalwen ti chaguyores.
So we gave you, or we're doing a example study just to give you a flavor or a taste of a particular type of research study that we could conduct.
Tandatanga suge ngone kotochiati karesena ji tangtu derupjia tangta do yuge shimjiki ji pitsun chunchun chikshio resta tikaresena chitang shimjik kandas chig yobati ji drua ji nyung ji chetins.
And so you'll recall that the question that this particular study examined is what's the relationship between people's emotions or moods and their quality of their sleep that they've gotten over the past month.
Tatanda digging as we shimji tonto digi and Joati Karesana and then Divi Dawachikering Larwa, Migi Samkange Nibabdi Kandadochi, but now Samkange Nibabdi Latinade and a Karsuganasugi, and Nila Yashin Kandastik do say Chorwa, Digi Parogan Joati said, and it Kesanga Sotoachi Tansaju the Dagi, and it will meet the race.
And we also added some additional questions, for example, whether or not you're a monastic, to allow us to examine particular nuances or kind of sub-questions under that research study.
And
you did a wonderful job getting your friends and family members to complete this self-report questionnaire. And Nicole, do you want to advance the slide? So we're really excited to report that 313 people completed this particular questionnaire. So thank you for doing such a great job of spreading this out to your friends and family.
다시 속에 지금 족보 정보당 단 농미당 뜻을라야 단다게 좋아텔라 렌자로 지세 지요랑 집대라 연주 시지로 지스 냠신나로 지스레 리쿠페 야포나샤 스로아치 수티강라 리쿠페 야포나샤 다다 텔라야 트토케 아니 지 트랑투드르 지야게 냠시텔라 냠신 나니테 두시 남켄테 미 순자당 족슨 정샤스 tin스담베 치수페 야포나송스.
And did anyone have any difficulties or problems completing the questionnaire? Was anything unclear while you were completing the questionnaire?
아니 단데 좋아테다 렌자베 값스 지 흥에 태주로다 야나치 카스오 메주당 드네로 정송에사 정선 성민다. Nobody said.
No problems. Good. Okay, that means it's clear, and that's what we want when we do a particular research study. Nicole, do you want to? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
민두 선거도 같이 빼야부 정샤 certain가 속에 지금 데라로 지금 나비 값스 조데 아니 지금 파조텔라 약간의 마트와 지금 와과라 트바 지금 좋았던 거에 대해 무시하게 요레스.
So you recall that the first set of items that we asked about pertained to a number of kind of components of sleep over the past month. So let me rephrase that. The first thing that we asked about is the quality or amount of sleep that you've gotten over the past month.
다 좋아되게 나네 딘슨다 당보기 차티카레스나 준 디비기 다와 치그랑라야 지금 아니때 준랑로 퀸사 당니기 다 피카스 마소나 니티 야로 쿠송세게 디트랑 다와요 피기 좋았던다레스.
Now, when you develop a research study, it's hard sometimes to come up with the right questions. So my question for you is, are there any items that you would have added to this particular questionnaire that you think we missed out or that we left out?
다 적당게 지금 심지지 스타발라의 심지지 값을 야 참참라 대용 그래서 그래서 저한테 딱딱지 지야 카보딘으로 저 야보딘 마라바 저한테 내가 캐보딘 통마트게 니통딘 좀 그래서 단다시 수고 저한테 달라타 값을 알레던 디낭라야 저한 딘다 지금 간은 지나 야고도와 사면로 당 디강라 딘다로 지 체대선데 지 간은 지나 데레 야가 정사에서 딘다로 정송에서 Joala Lenjamindama.
Malay Kande Tanso says, Yellow Yava Tanso, Dija Tanso says.
All right. Gele is saying maybe there should be a like question about dream. Did you dream like a sweet dream or a bad dream? Something like that.
Very, very interesting. We'll talk later today a little bit about the neuroscience of dreams.
Tatirang also the Melamtande we once at Henrique Koreorwati, Tiranga Sujelaya, Mutojians.
But that's a great question. If we could ask people if they've had dreams, and we could also ask them if they might have nightmares that wake them up in the middle of the night that disrupt their sleep.
Otepe Abudus and also Melam Tanson Mason say Kijetang. Ngaso melam chuson yese kejetre sto melam chusan sma melam chus tambalaya chanda koyang kore pe ni seyong achi to otina do johnson to tinda tana ndigwa sto pe yapadus.
So another important decision when you're making a self-report item is the time period that you're studying. And we selected the past month, but do any of you think that it would have been better to ask about the past week or maybe about the past year or even just in general, trying to get a sense of their kind of general patterns over their life?
Da sususuge nyansan shijuge da shimjig tindarwa sususuge agarungune nyansan shijuge toa telendina instambala yan de la kanda sorsonstan de kapsanga suge thakare cheoresena chitsutirwa chitsutin devigi dawa chigirangla kanda chongson sege chitsuti tanke chi dus ke jatujugires e chitsuge kanda samgudus tele yamna devigi dunta chigirangla kanda chongson esendo na devigi lu chigirangla ya kanda chongson sendo yana ya chitsungi me ganesh chitang chane kanda do chongson ese tinado go chodo leson es.
So the past month may seem like a good idea to folks. I think it was a good idea for us because it gives us kind of a general sense, but it's not so long that people can't remember.
Tatanda industena shizuga sungum dorwa tin tambala tanda devigi dawa chix ate peche ju tatando jing insar was chichina karchinla na de sto shita junrampo member yang chi jongju de ganza tamba yang de suwa chi gorwa yang tong maimba chi tatando chi de ndo chi redwas.
Nicole, can you advance the slide? So the next set of questions that we asked you about particular emotions that you might experience and how frequently you have those emotions.
That drug is in Nipati Kalana Samkan on David Tawara, Samuel Corti Triores, that the Canada Triores, no Samuel Kari Johnson, the Manglo Johnson said the Tuatares.
And we generated this list based on emotions that are frequently studied in kind of Western academic science.
Tatanda Gitila ya Tuatri, Samuel Cortiora, Tita Chivina, the Nepchoke. Some kind of pattern you get any Tuatina, Tashi with two Pechutango to some Kachigadus the Koyes.
But that doesn't mean that it necessarily translates to other societies. So a question that we have is, are there certain emotions that you think we should have added to this questionnaire that were not included on this questionnaire?
That and I get to a thing on Laya Samuel Kachi or what Samuel Kachi to the Nipshopagi who Tashichi Pechutangi Samuel Kachi Shisha, the Tanga to this restaurant. This Tambala question to Mando and Ateli, his Tambala could tata them degnate in that Chunguris. That's it. So in Tambala, Tandagi Samuel de Takagalaya, young Samuel Canon Chiguagi, and it not that way, Samuel Canonchi at the Road Does. Canonchi Guesa than did and don't Sangam do dig out the Tepado dinner Yuna Yasare Summit in the Road Johnson.
Namji Mazo Tanyo Sergi Shagra, the origin, Tanyo Sergi Shagra.
More.
Tamya Mazo Namji, they were doing a budget, in the Tanyo Gilele Bandage. You know your Tanyo Dimida.
More. And what Gala is saying is that we usually have like happy or sad and then neutral feelings. That
neutral feelings?
Yes, neutral. The balanced feeling or yeah. And he says and that is obvious. Sometimes we're happy, sometimes neutral, sometimes sad. So that is like in Tibetan in the Buddhist society, that is like a three component that usually comes together. So maybe should have better to have that neutral feeling or neutral emotion in the survey.
You know, that's a great point, because in the science of emotion, people very rarely discuss just neutral or absence of emotion. And it's always kind of needs to be the fireworks of the presence of an emotion. So I think that's a really interesting point.
Samsute pe yapudus ta chitang imbana ta nashoke de wansa chen ke taxe chinu ka imbana khosu ge chi karsugur ta gawa tang chuan do ma to pe chi paro tangyong lam chi ate shu chi peche tang ge yo mares tin stambala de ha chang ge yapo chi re sha nga so ge chi karsugur da cho di me pi gi tangyong ge cho ate nan ji gwa de ha chi ke chimbu chag do pe yapudus.
In addition to neutral emotions, are there any other types of emotions that you think maybe are more frequently discussed in Tibetan cultures that we did not include on this questionnaire?
One in the text, Jamil said kutopo means timid.
Timid.
Or like narrow-minded or something like that. Kutopo.
What about like insightful? You know, when you're doing analytic meditation and you have an insight, is that viewed as an emotional state, or is that viewed more as a thought or cognitive state?
inside stambalaya nga suchika disgoro da topando nyech yorwada de chesuge kanada ula shisha gres tati shena ji nga suge samyang gang la shisha groe yana yang nga suge nginzin yorwada tang do yu chula shagres
Ni kabla shigoranda.
de ni kesamare nanga tokpa le ngishi le tisgoro da
Gen telaya kangichi chogoyasa. Na jini daw imba na yula zichi da gatse detwa ina dechoge jini ya gumde ya yabo chabe tagorwa.
re
Ane da handong daw imba ina da tomani daw imba ina digi ya kwa gatse ya ani chetoji gatse nyewa ina da toba zema tetsi ya mpara da digi ya seren daw ina digi ya chonzi chigorwa.
re da de nga su samyang na shagmarwa
Re. Ge danda de nembi ge na yabo yosara samsu danda de chwana la. Danda ngacho sum yama ani shibuji an tubo chaja de yana digoyna.
sen tubu chaya
Some tempo meaji yamashu yodeajiwa.
ore
Majojiwa inata gobaziaji.
ore gopa wasen gopa the earlier said like the insight is not a kind of emotion because like an insight there are two like in the two different meditations and the first the focused meditation is about like how long you stay focused and the analytic meditation like if you meditation on emptiness how high you get into the deep thought about emptiness. There's a like want to ask about is the emotion. He said it cannot be emotions. It's a different. Maybe you have mentioned about like the cognition.
Yeah.
And the other thing is in Buddhism, what they say is like one talk about mind or emotional mind. They say they you remember this like they talk about the monkey mind. So
yeah.
it should be like the mind cannot stay at one point. It just jumping around. So that can be over there. So your mind is not stable or something like that. Yeah, this can be a good thing to put in. Yeah.
Yes, stability of mind. That's very interesting. Yeah. Great thoughts. Just the last point I'll make here is there's a really interesting question in the chat about how there could be differences in the portrayal of sleep across cultures. And I think that's a really important point. For example, in certain cultures, people go to bed later than other cultures. And that would be important to take into consideration if you're studying sleep disruption, because going to bed later in another culture may be very normal, whereas going to bed earlier in another culture may be very normal. So it's important to take into consideration culture. Both in emotion and sleep,
and also monks do the afternoon nap for 1 or 2
yes, exactly. Yes.
Tanda shenda chi tanda de dog na la chat na chidwa di karsana nga so ni se di ko chitsuko kuri manda wa siguro da ko chitsuko kuri manda ni ga chitsuko kuri manda la tanda de yang ko ga ni de la ngunjin chi ta ti ta yang manda de yong gres ro ti karichini sena picha shana chitsukashing na la ya ko enye tis nye tis ngau nye gwa do ni ta tinda da yorwa kashin ba na ya chi chu nye te jinden do cha yu chu yorwa tin stam ba la ya na te tala ten de te yang asu ge chi ka chitsumando ge ni se chitsumando na la mi le ni da ge ni ta ten de shi jang stam ba la ya chitsuk ta ya ko ra li ge rest te la ngi dan ya chi chitsuin ba na pechua de ningong la ya 지가 애니 통통 de 지니 la 쿠거와 tinsta ba ya tian ko ni tamando chago yorwa o de decision ba til titala rally rest and the ne ko de chinton trasa de la ya george jute pe ya hotus.
Okay, Nicole, do you want to advance? And then the last set of questions we asked were what are called demographic questions. So these are questions to try to get more information about the participants that are completing the questionnaire.
다 단다게 좋아 지가 딘슨 심바티카레스는 주식진행기 아니 그게 다 그거 미기 로지당 대화요 주고 좋아 다다 미티 땅 주식진게 다 가원에 용인 발라스 바게 대떡당 대화요 주고 좋아 된다 인스.
Okay, you can advance, Nicole. So these are the first data from our questionnaire. Congratulations, here we are. And this is a depiction or a display of the proportion or number of people that are Tibetan monastics versus the number of people who are not Tibetan monastics who completed this particular self-report.
다 단다게 되게 좋아들라 인주시 진이가 나니로와 단다게 담보된 것을 디카레스나 아니 주시 진켄디 벽이 자주 이 면세하게 좋아되게 란 라주기 준비인스.
So proportion here means how many people compared to the people that completed this questionnaire. So we're only depicting the number of people who are monastics or non-monastics who completed this questionnaire.
단데 데카스는 가수 트브딩은 디나라야 도야팅 가수 드세치 땡고요로 드세티 카레스고스나 민주시 지위 참마겐 떤 주시 진킨 참마겐 안에 아니 따주 임바기 가수지레샤 말로 가수지레샤 따주 멤바디 가수지레샤 땡고요레스.
Now, a really important component of doing research are coming up with successful ways of presenting your data to the world so they can understand your study.
다 심지기 그런 게 듭차 차식 듭차 개치슈치 가르치고 그래서나 수수라이 덤디지 가리 라와디와 덤디 가리 지토바데 아니 그 채통 덴바가 강내로 팔라이 라투치트게 던트게 차고야되게 전부 차고요레스.
And there are many different ways that you can present your data, and each have their own pros and cons.
다 덤디테 때온 스tambalaya 덤디테 팔라이 무토치비 값서 텐탄 때고 지금 리근 담다 망보요레스 담다 망보요베 칸실라야 고초 지금 덤디 텐탄가 탑네 소소라야 고초라야 김펜 긴센타야 고 쮸엔데 요레스.
And this is what's called a pie chart.
단디가레스네 파이기 드르디레스.
And here the circle, as I mentioned, represents the participants in our study, the participants who completed the questionnaire.
다 단데데기다 gorgor되게 가르친 거래서는 가수가 디나틀린 주시진이 주거와 디나틀린 주시진이게 아니 지금 미 가수 정도 대청 거래스.
And here the blue color reflects the percentage or proportion of people who are monastics, and the orange color reflects the percentage or proportion of people who are not monastics.
다 단데데기 도원부 전천원부 되게 가르치는 주시 진행게 자중게 주시 진행하는 게 자샤 가수치 자중인 바다 얘네 되게 두세 가수치 자중인 바다 청거레스 현대게 가수 리트기 도치고 살만 도치고로 되게 가르치는 거레스는 자중면 비기 자차 당연한 자중면 비기 두세 청거레스.
And we can see here that we have a little bit more than 50% of monastics and a little less than 50% of people who are non-monastics.
다 단단가 수두스타 바이바나 주시 진행게랑네 자차 나치기 하츠 아니 자주인 바다 자차 나치기 용섬스 자즈멤바 디통고도스.
And we just, again, this shows you did a great job of getting people outside of the monastic community to complete this measure, which really will increase our ability to examine some interesting questions.
다 단다데 제속에 지 자중게 다 지 곰바 자창카기 추로게 밀라야 주시디 야부 지엘라야 지가 럭쇼페 야부 나샤스 밀란 주시 지 주샤스 틴스tambalaya 내가 수게 데토탄 데오요 주게 다 트완 데토탄 데오요 주게 지양 니탄 지가 쇼 젠다니 니탄 망보 지가 하쿠트 그레스.
Next slide, Nicole. So this figure displays the ages of the people who completed the survey.
다 단다데게 트시디게 가르친 거에서는 주시 단다게 좋아티 떠나텔 냠치 진이게 미게 아니 로초 같이 지금 받은 거레스.
And this is what's called a histogram.
다 단다데라야 땅아수 카르테 histogram 세나 데라야 다 에너지 세나 디고와.
And the horizontal axis, which is at the bottom, perfect. That is the range of ages of people who completed this particular questionnaire.
Ta tanda de nga so ge theti gang la yo chu dis gora ta theti gang la yo chu ti ola pha chu chu gora ti ge kare chong gore se na tanda din an den ju shi jingkheng gi mi gi lu cho gi ji da chapse chi gora ti chong go yores.
And the vertical axis, which reads number of participants, that shows you the number of participants in each of those age bins that completed the questionnaire.
Tanga suge te ta theti tu log chapse ti chomba che shonti ti ka songres na log chapse ti nang la ya ani ti nang na yo pi gi mi ka chu ke ne jushi chi sha sa chor wa ta da ge jushi jingkheng ge na ne jushi jingkheng ge khaton chomba ka la ya ani ko khaton te ta log chapse ka kheng na gangi na leg du se te chong gores.
So using this figure, can somebody tell us a little bit about the age of people that completed the questionnaire? Can somebody interpret the figure for us and tell us some stuff about the participants in the study?
Ta da dus nga su ge de la ya thiri chi do de de ta ani chi su ge mi chi ke thiri de la ya ko ande se chi ja ro chi das ti ge ani nga su ge twa ti ta kana la ta ka je chi ni nyam chi ti na tlen ju shi ching kheng ge lu chu ko la kanda ro chi kari chi de se ja dus ti ko la ani chi de se chi ja ro chi das de na.
Diridwa, participant from age 25 to 35, the maybe more than 100, almost 150. And the participant from age 15 to 25 is about 60. And it's maybe 70 or 80 something from age 35 to 45. And age 75, maybe very few, I think maybe 10%, maybe 10 or something like that.
Yes.
Wonderful. And there's a concept in statistics called the mode, which is the most frequent response. So what's the most frequent response or the most frequent age here?
Ta tanda gisile de se jatan ba nga sun sta ba ne nistanga ne sun songa parta ta jatanga chi ma sun sam sa to swa jatan sun chi chi chwa tene lu sum songa ne chi shenga parta ne ta nga chu dun chu je chi ma sun sam sa to ani dusre shas chapse ti tinda do chi ri dusla gela ge de se ja la nga chu ge ta de la ye mot la na ta kar se gore ta chap chi shin ro te se gore ta mang shi ro te ro dus nga chu ta bai na dinan jushi jingkhen te ro mangshi te lo ka chone ka so padal shas the chair says 25 to 35.
Right. It's actually, so the horizontal axis is in increments of 10, but we actually have the data every 5 years. So we can actually look at this and say it's basically age 30 is the most frequent, the common person who completed the measure.
Ta tanda sirge lo ge chi chapse do imbaina lo ta phayati lo ngari do parola tu shayo restin stambala ya tanda dus ta baina ngaso ge jushi chingkhna mangshite ro ane lu sumchula res.
And the last thing I'll say here is that you can also look at the range. So we have an incredible range in this particular study from people who are 5 years old all the way to 75 years old.
Tim senga chu lo ge chapse skoro wa tim baina de la ya pe Shichambo yores, Yabo yores, Chapcha yores, Pichashana, Zushi Chinkende, Lo Ngani, Lo Dunchtonga Partaduas, Zushi Chinkende.
I'm very excited to announce that the 5-year-olds are Nicole's children.
And then the Shikarajan again, Nicole. Nice.
Okay, next slide, Nicole. So another question that's interesting to examine and research is the breakdown of men and women, or male and female, or transgender, or others who prefer not to say their sex. So this particular slide depicts that.
Ani ngasu twa chuko mo ani maning seguro atchi ani khashim bane seni tugum du sa chora sende shem du sa chora oteton digaten yores.
And can somebody interpret this slide for us?
Ta te ge tanda de la yang asu de to te Tirich dwa. Odela ya deshi chonro nandas.
Yes,
English
I will do. Okay.
Ani shayala chonro na.
Yeah, I think from this chat is show the almost 75% of participant is male, and I think around 25% is female. And then there's no participants of transgender and prefer not to say.
You sort of
A little bit.
Little bit, yes, yeah, little bit transgender, yes. I think it's like 5%, only like 2 or 3%.
Perfect. Thank you, Shoyan. I can't see your name, but I can recognize your voice. Now I can see you. Wonderful. Nicole, do you want to go to the next slide? And the final thing that we'll say is this is the number of participants in the different countries that completed this questionnaire. And as you can see, most of the participants are from India and the States. And that makes sense because the people who are involved in today's conversation are from India and the States.
Manchester Jakarta ani ti arela tusti tati ko tatadoshi degi ores jinsen karchila baina tiringa su sabjonde la yenzu shichinya da chamado tiro ta Manchester do te la rota Jakarta arena yores.
So we would need to be cautious in generalizing our results from today's study beyond India and the United States, and that's always one of the tensions that you have in research is you need to be careful of generalizing your results outside of the populations that you're studying.
Matsuge dinan the switch in your manchu Jakarta arrange tambalaya, tigi chilok jakwa kalaya chiditana tisian ko kangedo yores roa tin stambade chitange chitaxi shimji chons tambala kogi chi that some do masona chi karjando masona chi chaga yores tilaya ne chi karsugureta zabza chi gures.
Nicole, do you want to take it away?
Great. So what we want to do next is show examples of some questions we can try to address with the data that we have, and also talk a little bit about how we collected those data. So one challenge of survey data is that everybody is providing that data for themselves, and sometimes they don't answer all of the questions.
Yes, please go ahead.
So if you look here, it says NA on the graph next to Nepal, and those represent participants who did not indicate what country they are currently living in.
Nepal
And so when we look at the data in a moment, you'll see NA either represents that the participant did not provide information, or the information they provided did not make sense because they didn't understand the question.
Tatandage Natsuke Shenda Walla Tagres, that draw the Nadokas and eight juice, and eight judilaya, Chini, and Kuge Kasugre, Trotilla, Len Jama Bata, and Yini Trotilla Len Jayona Yankoga Lenti Chikas Tata Jama Parwa, Lenti Tata Jama Stambalaya, draw the Hamakug on the Lenja Judo when it's not Chayores.
Okay, so the first question that we're going to ask with our data is Rob and I just decided to see if we could get sort of a preliminary assessment if Tibetan monastics are happier than those participants who said that they were not Tibetan monastics.
That's my by Shenley Chipurin dues, Shenda Nadrubaina Chiparin dues, to it on the.
So first, before we sort of look at that, the results and how we decided to use these data, I want to show you how we collected the data.
Trangto data Canada redo Matago Welaya, Natsu Carita against Sena, Trangto de Tampotela Natsu Candas, Duruchi Ticolatagins.
So in this, what's called the spreadsheet, you filled out a form, and then each row represents one participant.
That Digalaya, and it's to get the Tratoko Nyamsichia get the Pancho de Jango or what? That in the Jones Tambalaya, Dene Natsuki, Tetikala Pata by Nat Teti Songoresena, and then Zushi Chinkini Lankarija to the Songores.
So this first row here was our first participant. And these three rows, for example, represent myself and my two children.
That Tamboteta Karinsena, and a Zushing Tamboteche, and a Tandage Tampuge Kashish Tokatuzu, Gelata, and a Gelage, Puguzu, Yamshi student race.
So my daughter, who is row 3, goes to bed about 9 p.m., which is 9 o'clock in the evening. She falls asleep very fast in 5 minutes, and she wakes up at 6:45 in the morning.
Tandage de Teti Sumbana, I should take Gelaga Pomoche, Niati Katini Gorena, Gondach to Guanyagores, and then Nienuga Jelaya, and Kamangas Nala, and Nikundugores, Nea Layati Katilongores to treat and commission along yours.
And if we scroll over, we can see all the other information she provided. She's a very happy person. So she said here that she's happy a lot of the time.
Tatanda Moge, Mo Kipu Tornig Pumuchires, Dera Taba, Mana Kipu Duelana, Chipushu do say, Chiputi Mambu Johnson said, then Jadwas.
And if we go farther, we'll see that she's 7 years old.
Then look at her, no look the race.
And she is not a Tibetan monastic. So if we sort of look at other data, we can see that there's some challenges of how people provided data that could make it hard to analyze. So if you look here, so each of these, can you see my arrow? Oh,
yes.
Right. So each of these is called a column, right? And this is the information on during the past month, how many minutes did it take you to fall asleep? And some people used a number, some people wrote an answer in Tibetan, and some people wrote an answer in English.
Then they let up by Nangatsuka Katu Ma Jonturi Latabai by Nako Ganlai Trotical and then David Wachkan Lacho, my Ninu Jelaya, Ninu Jela, Nikola, Karmakatsungur Sonsegorwa, the Kashim by Nako Trankati Saja to Sayores, Kashim by Na Igna Tridoa, Karmachungas Tridoa, Kashim by Na Inchinaya, Kamachungas Tridoa.
And these are things that as a team, we were able to fix or clean over the last couple of days.
That and the data tawin by na then David Makashirang Latanga so Jinyamshi Chini Koso the Dincentigone and Samazut to your recent data.
So these are the data that are just sort of cleaned up, and you can see that we've changed all the times it takes to fall asleep to just numbers.
That under the Kalana standard and go to this Samazus Hajugi Tantu Teres and Dela Imbana Chianiquela Kamakasong or Society, Manchishitanga Dela Samazuchi Tangana Trishayus.
Now there's some data within a survey that you may not be able to just sort of fix in that way because the answer may not make sense and you just have to leave it as it is.
The Kashim Bananga so Kalana drug lunch judge or Telaya Samazua Mechuchi, Kualamatkachi, Kualansam do at Yorwa, or Tenda do your instance number Kanda Yopatran Shagu Yores.
So as an example, here in this row, I interpret this as that the person goes to bed at about 7 o'clock in the evening and wakes up at 7:30 in the morning, which would be a very long time for sleep, which would be about 12 hours, but they say that they only sleep 1 hour a night.
That under Gangi Serpujabjidua, then Dimbana ko Truati, Kuala, like a couple of Karchila Vina, ko Katinigi Yolana, then stood the Gondach to Dumbalanigi like Dusra, Nikatilango Yolana, Shopach to Denta Chegalango like Dusra. Taku imbana Munetan Sabana, Niqua, so the general Poshure, so Junior Hatsla Nikuyorwa, imbana new general Locuson Lana, and Stochila Cuson Segalentus Jabchas.
So one thing that you often do when you're collecting survey data is you may use this survey, give it to some people and realize, oh, this might be a question that's hard for some people to understand. We should change it before going forward with a bigger survey.
That Tanda dinner doing by night, young Sansaman dinner, your Stroachi Zura, Troati Mission, the Latin Kusel Lanjagachi, and it was Nitantelata by Nakashigi, Aleti Troati to Stana Migi Lanjaga Kalakapuyos and Gunyopios at Instambalaya, Mission Dalaya and Zushichi Machkun Walaya, and it could Troatala and Jiratangu do say Nitantian Chongres.
One other thing I'll point out, because you're going to be looking at these data yourself in a moment, is that for the time you often go to bed and the time that you wake up, a lot of people said that they go to bed in the morning, like 9 in the morning or 10 in the morning, and those may be mistakes, and maybe they meant 9:30 in the evening. But again, in many cases, it's very hard to fix, and we don't want to change it if we're not absolutely sure.
The Kashim by Nagonda Katunyagi Sena, then Katunyagi Sena, Shopach to Guanyagi, Shopach to good Chekanagi, Sagit in that those Chichina Gonda in the way in cigarettes, in by Nayan, Tanda de la Yako, Carsagoreta, in Jiratana, Great Gordayan, Tanda de la Yako, Jirata, the Kapungores.
That being said, there's a lot of data here, and science is always messy.
That under Digi Karisungores and Asula Trantuta pe Hacha Mamboyores, Hachu Mambo Unimise, Nitsenrikitachi, Topataritan Tanda Shimjing the Imbana, and Chikara, and Yukta Saurua, Chikanda Chilochores, Katina, Yukta Sauchiores.
So let's look at a few questions. Okay, so going back to this question, the question is, are monastics happier? And so what we did is we first said, who said they were a monastic and who said they were not. Let's get it. Right, so this is the people who said they were monastic. And we have about 170, and we have about 139 people who said they're not monastic. That's in the total.
That under the Troati Natsu, that Ratsunsun mission that it is keep a due, Sekajati Troati Trans Tambalaya, Natsukare Tagresena, that me, that Lenjaning on it, Tatsun Rindu, that's means a Troati, and Tatsun you make a Sundu Shishasana, Jatan Chundum Gumi Jatan Dunjin Shishasra, Tatsun many Jatachun so good, Chundum Mijatan Suzogun Shishas.
So there are many ways to sort of look at these data to try to answer this question. But what we focused on is what proportion of people said they were happy a lot of the time.
Ta tanda nga su ga tangtu de la tene de te nga su ga ko iship chi de tan reshe ndam da chi reshe nita mambo gna ja yo res tanda nga su ga ta kare tagins na chipu mambo chanson se te la tagins.
So to figure out the proportion of monastics that are happy a lot of the time, we would take these 94 participants who say they're happy a lot of time and say what proportion of the total is that?
Ta tanda ge tandage mi ta kushugana ko trachungana kipu shiu du search koro ta tapar kipu yung du se tigi khatante ani chondam la tir de ta korangana ne jacha katsu chi ani karsagore ta jacha katsu chi chipu ma du se te tana degrees.
And we can do the same thing for non-monastics. So the proportion of non-monastics who are happy a lot of time would be 75 divided by 139. I can't actually see that number. Robin's head is on top of it.
Tanga suge shendeshi kare tayore senanga suge tretsu minju nane yanko chondom katsu chidu teganane mi katsu chipo mambo du se telatin de nga su jacha titsenen gores.
And we don't want to just compare these numbers because this makes it look like more monastics are happy a lot of the time, but of course more monastics answered the survey.
Tanda nga suge chipu ma chonsong se khatan rang la tanen dikuyo mare swa karchila baina dusta baina khatante chitatsung nane ma yochido yu tu ina ya zushu chingken gi chondan la ta baina ya tatsung nane zushu chingken ma duas.
So this
how often said like this paging data instead of asking question how often happy asking something like how often said, I think then if you do the comparison between the monastics and the Tibetan, I think you will get a quite a difference in the answer.
Do you want to translate that, Dawa?
Tanda shende kushi zampu tanda de chipa de la go arwata te memba chinga se troati chipa memba je chua de se samba chua de de se ge troati le shisha pa ba na nga so ge tangtu de la tin de tana nga su thama ge tindri te yang tis mando chongres.
That is absolutely something we could do, and thinking about our conversation before might get more at that sort of neutral state, right?
Yeah.
Imagine that Tibetan monastics are sort of more at that neutral. So yeah, they're not more happier more, but they're also maybe sad less. They're just sort of staying neutral.
Ote date dusta tanda nga su dusta ba imbana tinbi shenda legres ti nansing nga su tangi gi chi tangnyong ko chwa chi wa ti ko korte yong gres yang ko skare tokpas chipu ma imba che yang chi shua ma nywa imba che yang parola ya tangnyong ge ne tang te yang chi yong yo sigres.
So just to walk you through this, here on the horizontal axis, which is also called the x-axis, we see people who are not monastics say that they're happy about 55% of the time. They say they're happy a lot of the time. And about 55% of the monastics say that they're happy a lot of the time.
Tetu galaya ne chitatsu imbe membe sa atigatwatres tatsu membe na hanam jachagi ngachunga ngaske aneko chiga tapar chiga kibudu sa ati len heshas ani tatsu inju na jachanga chinga ngach ke yang ko chibudu sa len hedus.
So do you find these results expected, surprising? What do you think?
That's a kind of so good that Trinity dinner do chirashas, that Trinity chicken samlin and dinner do younger Samsung Trinity the Yansen Chile do Samsons.
It is injured to the injured.
They think, yeah, it expected.
For me, it's a little bit like surprising.
What did you expect?
I expect monastic is more happier. But in this data show, it's the same, right?
Yes. So the data, the data shows that it's the same.
Yeah.
Or definitely, so the next step, once we sort of see the data, is we can actually sort of use math to analyze the data further and look for a significant result. And these definitely, there is no strong difference between the two groups.
다 아니 저인 바이나 뭐 양센 소스카르치라 바이나 뭐게 리오 카르치오르스나 치타츠스 지바 유기레 삼촌스 현달레로 와이나 텐데 리그모두 스타딘 신스탄발라야 단데 ngasoge 다 도안딜라 텐데 다 nga솔라 탕토 디라 치라요르와 임바이나 ngasoge 카스브레다 지금 앙츠 페슈 땅데 땅야 고게 탕토 데라야 양치 단동 지금 십시지야데 지바이나 양 고게 primary drawchil head or the imbatina young could herpetis this you moyate tonsigres timda tanda chala yang asu data chipathong.
So one thing that's interesting is Robin and I were also surprised. And the next step could be, if you were going to use the survey further, to actually talk with participants to find out what they really think when they say a lot, or how happy do you have to be to say a lot, because there may be something in there that we're missing.
Tanda data la gela number in by the trinity thon de han sang song swa ko image la karche or system bala nga so geta te ge mil zushi chini de trot yor chara chi tapper kipudu se ta ta chipu mambudu system bala ya ti kanda ro chi la ko len go se trot or wa ta trach or wa data la Titala Yanchi Trina in Bana Nitante Mando Chasigis and Nicole. For me, like for me, Tibetans in general and are not a good self-reporter.
That could be very true, and that could be very important for sort of the research initiative of ETSI as we move forward.
Yeah.
Is to work with sort of across the cultures to figure out if we're collecting these kind of data, is there a better way?
The Tandangi said the Kalaranga Sochi, the Pupachire, Laport, Pupachi Tanda, Tatsuim by Nachi, Susu Muni, Yama Joachi, or Watigalaya, John Stambalashu, Nelitupu Jotkumanga, the Tata Tatarachi Shetkam, do I mean Shendan Anjingra, Stambalaya. Tatandanga so Gilagasonala, Emery to Poch Henry Leramgi ko Jimalaya, Tashinji did a routine Stabalayan, Titala Shisha de Tanko, Chitsotan, Chikorik, Nibala Shisha de Tanako, Masoge, Taxation Gigiagin, Tindazuach or what, Tindado in Iris.
But I think many researchers would also say that all humans are bad self-reporters because we all have our biases as to how we understand ourselves.
다 현대 인바나 연코 지금 닥시신지 나니게 갈스가는 지금 다 드럼이 참아 인바나 수수수수 문에 영화 조용 스tambalaya 야다코 두차 레시 야부 마레스 수수 영화데 조트니 야부티나 마레스 데시자가르스 칼치 바나 수수수수라야 나츠고 니가 쇼션테 요로와 니가 쇼션테 요바지 니 스tambar 수수수 문에 판 데시자운 스tambalaya 가부차에 틴데 요레스.
So let's look at one more question. So this is a question, do sad people sleep less? So this is us trying to connect the data about emotions with the data about sleep.
Tanda thing as to draw Shenda Jetagins, draw Shenda de Caretagins, and any not so some Jewy meaty, and any one Yego at what it is, or some Jew you meet and you Yego at what it is, studying by nothing as to get young. Come down and Nig Parola and draw to Jugi and
So can one person sort of quickly give us a hypothesis about what you would expect?
Dr. Nicole?
Hello?
Yes, Chancellor.
Like, can we generalize?
Yes.
Yeah. Can we generalize, like, since there's a pandemic right now, so can we generalize, like, monks were kind of a little sad. That's why they have, reported that they are unhappy. I mean, this there is a a discrepancy. Like they said that it's kind of surprising, those graphs. So can we generalize situations such as corona pandemic, which has made them such result, that such outcome had come,
Yeah, I would say as research. Oh, do you want to translate that one?
And again, Chamchula get to the Tanda Nasuge. That's to gender Kipudu said the Trinity and some question around Nasuga, Machu, Tin Stabalaya. Tinda chonga ge sente tanda nga so ge toye gi nyenram chorwa dilatani chongre se nga so chiti tanga digres.
This is a really good point, in that oftentimes any kind of experiment you do, you get the results and then you need to try to understand the context and maybe understand what the next step is or the next study you need to do is.
That and they drop a abuchires, Chitang in Banang, so Tosin Jions Tambala, the Chunker in the Jions Tambalaya, Trimbrin the Lions Tambalaya, Trimbrin dig in Nathan Kanaruchin do te Hakuache, Dig Jelaya Combas, that Jimati Kanaruchi Pubu said, Telaya, Chestan in the Yores.
So 2 ways to do that is we could say, okay, we're going to do a study a year from now when everybody's vaccinated and this is all over. Or we can ask people to sort of reflect on whether they think they were happier before the pandemic than now.
That under road Triviala Yang Asukan Yores, Chikanda Digres, not under Lu Chiki Jela, or Lu Chiki Gonu Jela, Mid Samalaya, Tanda Gomenti Jamnu Jela Yang Asu Yangshe, Takshe Shinji, Chiri and Canada, Trimdik and the leg the standard Gores. Them say, and it Tandangasu Tandagi Dede, any Tandagi Tandangasu de Nyeram Chigoro and Yeram de Toigan Yan de Machu and Wella Yachu Kandaruchi, say a trot in the Tanchi Tanand Gores.
So
Hello.
Oh yes. There are questions and opinions to share. Nicole, do you want to go forward with this?
Let's move on to this second question, because you'll get some time in breakout rooms in just a moment, and you can talk about these questions and come up with some questions of your own that might be the right follow-ups. So
Tandanga Sumeta to Druins, right? The Jela Yachian Rukosha Jede on some Susan Jela Yangasuga draw to Smith Cookit in the Chongres, or take up such in the Gores. Yes.
So if we focus on the question, do sad people sleep less? In the chat, we see sort of both hypotheses, and in some ways sort of based on our previous knowledge on what we know, that it makes sense that sad people may have a harder time sleeping because they just can't get comfortable, they're worried, or you may sleep a lot to just so you don't have to deal with your problems.
Tanda Delang to draw de la Yatsuan number new, but then Changa to the Trentona Teletasha dos Roaching so Yakashim Bana Carsogoreta, Sambachua, Banani Mark Kachila Vaina, a young Carsogoreta, and you try to Zulaya, Donanchi Gumaro, and you could have bana, Tenado Sami Yores, Chandati Bana Yanko, New York, Carcilla, Sambachu Capsi, Bana, some Kamadio, Tinadu Capsa, and you queer Capuyores, Tendayores, Tinstamble Treasure in Chaleshas.
So to answer this question, or to begin to answer this question, we looked at how often people said they were sad. We have not at all, a little, and a lot. And then these people, 12 people, did not answer the question. And this is the average number of hours the people in those groups got of sleep each night.
Tatanga so dig that draw the lenja, the Tranto de Taba in Banaro, and Sambashua, it's one of my John said that Johnson Shamampuchon, so what the Lema Jeju to the Yoroa, that the Tamadelaya, Nibatina Layanga soon the switching Katar was, but the Laya Chanyum Gikuzo, Stokatsuchla, Ni Rasha said it is.
So if we look at that in a graph, and now I've removed the people who didn't answer the question. Here we have the people who said, I haven't been sad in the last month. I've been a little sad in the last month, and I've been sad a lot. And really sort of the average sleep each of the people in each of those groups get is highly similar.
channyomgi new katsuchirasha sena halam down do yung gores tan de kapsin bana ko le maje chuchi gorwa samba chuwa chung se len je maje chuti nga su tang tanda ge thirin dina lem do ga istambala ya tandan chu simchala ta baina channyomgi ni ra gi chuchi gorwa tin down do chung shas.
So there's a very good question in the chat that I'm going to actually turn over to Robin because I think he's thought about these kinds of data more. And the question is, how reliable is data collection on subjective matters like happiness and sadness, as different people may have completely different interpretations of the same questions? Robin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And that's going to be a big focus of the final part of this presentation if we have time to get to it. But it'll definitely be a focus of the research training in the ETSI sustainability phase, because Tenzin talks about a very important issue, which is that we sometimes are very poor reporters of our own emotions and our own behaviors. Dawa?
Da de Tenzin rabgala ge dina twach to the pe ya go do speech shana nga su su nyungwa tang de yo chu gi jigor da de ge nyungwa tang de yo chu pe shana ki pudu se ta du pudu se ta de ta ke ani tramtho de ta la ya chi yiten rongwa ka se te kana ro chi yo res ka chi la pa na nga su me la ya su ge ta chi de ta tanda ge su ge rang ger ge nyungwa ti de she ja ge Nitsa mando yor wako kualan tong kromando re deshe jatong kromando re tis tambalen de yitne ro kanda yores the tit dron tambale gelage tanga suge emerton poch sanri leram gi tanda gi ta tanda nga so takshe gi jiga leram chigoro wata di kapsi bana ani ditak gangla ya ani jiga karso gore ta jiga jiga simji che ta tingala ya ne zongres keti nga sula ani chendo chi chomba ina so jiga laba ina jula ani tanda gi ditak tan ro yu chu gi ina jiga lamtsin tinda tisingo chu cha yes.
And just one more point, we'll discuss soon, as well as in the research training program in India, other measures for getting more reliable metrics of people's sleep quality, including measures of the brain using EEG.
Ta shendan bana nga su ga ta yetan rongwa gi tablen tang ka tang tu ti dre chi ya gi chete ni takshe gi tablen ka ri tan yo met zo nga su ta jongjir wi gi jongjir ta nga su takche gi sabjong kap nga su ngotro chi gi spicha sha bana nga su ge chi ko ni ya pu ra go de ra go mu se la ya ani yetan rongwa gi tang tu dre chi la nga su ge lepa gi lesa ge logri chi ro ta EEG la so pat zo le chi ro wa te ta la yang te ta ka tap ti tan yo res.
Nicole?
That being said, surveys are an incredibly helpful tool. That these data might actually be quite accurate. It may be that there really is no link between the emotion of sadness as we understand it and how much sleep we get.
Ta tanda nga su ge 지금 ko ge la ya chi ta ginsin tang chuncha mang po chi ga da yin bai na ya tanda nga su ge dire ro ge chi che chip che de ge tang thun de ta shok chi ne yang ko pen to po shu din da yo res wa chi chi na nga su de ge ta kar su ge da de ta la ten de nga su ge chi sam khan ta chi sam yong ta ni ge pa ro ge ro ti nga su chin zu ko yo wa chi chi bai na ta tan ro de yo ke chi chi bai na ya ko ni ge pa ro la ro tin ro chi me pa in si res.
Just one point on that, Dawa. I think it's important to recognize that we're studying this relationship between sleep and emotion amongst a group of people who are pretty happy. And it may be that if we had more depression in our sample and more serious negative emotions, that we would start to see this relationship. So we always have to be cautious about generalizing our results beyond our sample.
Ta tin sta bala nga su kare chi sa chi gore se na nga su ta nda de la chi to la le len ja ni gen zu shi na ne de chi sam lu na ne chi sam ba ki pu yu chu ge mi na la ya zu shi chi ni ma chong re tin sta bala ya ke ti nga su gar wa chi sam la ya sang ye yu ni ta chi sam ba chi ki pu me ni ge mi na la ya du ji ba ina nga su la ya chim de man do chi yong gre sro tin sta bala nga su ta she shim ji Canada which chiba in a young cook trimdi de Latin de Chidita Chorwa, de Latin de Allen de Latin generalized Chorwa, de Tenda and the nature Resha Sagi, Chidita Nagi, Nitantila Yang Atsuge, Zabzuchi Guati, Hatchinke Chambuchagioris.
So what we'd like to do now is we're going to go into breakout rooms, and we'd like each group of 5 breakout rooms, each group to come up with at least 3 questions that we could ask with our data. And in just a moment, I'll put a link so that if you are able to, you could actually go look at the survey to get a reminder of the questions that we asked.
Tanda digital answer Kongalaya Gushik Jabra, Rukanaya, Karachi Sena, Tanda Natsu, Tantu Chirayorwa, Tantu Raju Tigi Kanlaya, Natsu Tuakari, Karichin Chokoresa, Rangasu Tuakari, Karichin Chokoresa again. Tuatin and over recording on Nontala to a simdism to Rochis, that under the Yamtung Azuge, Tanda Cheship Nanju, Tuat Jugichi, Tigi, Tuatic Tratate, do like Krugins, Yanchesu, Tuati Karakari in Tengimduna, and Etila Tana degrees.
And we will give you 5 minutes. You can come up with questions, and we'll at least have a couple of groups report back some of those questions so we can think about them.
Karmanga use Karmanga not let talk ton do setting to the Girochis, anything Jelangatsuge share young that any Rukachin chicken winning banner Susuga Kare chicken chison Ticola, Tuati Karakari something on Nyam to the non degrees.
Hi, Nicole. It's a 5 group, 5 minutes.
5 groups, 5 minutes. Give me just a moment to share the link to the data.
The Tanda Kesang get watch or watch, non you get watch or what, take a link chickrosat or teaches to Tanda Kachishana group go suggestion at time in the what.
So with this link, you can actually see that spreadsheet where we shared the data. And at the top of the first one that's called raw, you can see the questions that we asked.
But under the there's a Tantu the Dodo, you get the link there, Sharwa. Any Tantu Nalaya raw data says you take Nalaya, Tamig Lank under the job to some of your wrist. That take Tampu Tampunga to get Tetikala, you get Tamputin Nalaya, Tuakarikaritan said, what it is.
I'll try to send everybody some of our results to try to look at some of the answers to these questions.
That so draw you know what under the check not draw cheese or draw the chela gilage draw the shisha the tanga so get Netantuchi or what you not that they don't try to land they doomed the tagins.
So the one thing I want to point out is this word correlate, and that is that you could imagine if you're a really happy person, it's just easier to wake up and you wake up earlier. Or if you wake up earlier, maybe because you hear the birds singing in the morning, it makes you happier. So we might see a relationship and then need to understand what is affecting what.
That Tanda gets Shendachi de la Shenito, but they correlate, I think that's what Tunde or Tunde Jushayore, Mama Ragling devastation. Tanda Tunde said, the Pichashana, Natsumi, Sampachiba Yopana, Chiganise, Sopango, Nise, Lil How you do, Jiggy young Korean Parland, Dum de Tayore, and Shendachi, Shopa Karsagore. Chopin now that they got to chew, we get in the Tabaina, Yanko Tilat in the Samba Gali, Yanko Nise Chua, or Tusku Parola, that Tunde Karichu Metela Tanat Chorus.
Great. So add more questions to the chat if you have more, and then I'm going to turn it over to Robin.
That why you find that what under the Tenton Tansatina Danochis.
Great. So there was some really interesting conversation that was taking place in the chat about the pros and cons of self-report and the extent to which it can really, people can reliably report their sleep and emotion.
Nga tsuge te chentong tangsa tena tele nga tsu rang te genyen tu su nige te chu genyen tu te la ya chi kar sakure ta chiga ginchen gichun kari yo me te kola ya deshe jashas te kola to ta.
And as Nicole mentioned, self-report measures are really important because we really care about people's self-reported experience around things such as sleep and emotion.
다단다가 저게 지금 수수게 랑 거르군이 대주기년 투치고라 데 개침부 차고요 레스겐 니콜 소나신 갈치라 바이나 가수이나 지금 미기 거르 수수문이 쳐주고 용알아요 주기 지가 니가 쳐라서 당 삼박이 지금 삼용대 간다 삼칸 간다 레서 때라야 지금 개침부 지기요 누타게 단다게 개침부 차고요 레스랑 대기년 투디.
But as was mentioned in the chat, there are also limitations of self-report. And one of those limitations is that people often are not very good reporters of their own self-sleep or their own emotions for a number of reasons.
다양 콜라야 전차요레스 전차요바데 가르치네레스나 미이나 쳤던 그 수수수수비 중요하다 되게 콜란 데시 잠스탄발라야 데시페 야고 잡기요 마레스 인스탄발라 데라 전요레스.
And I noticed there's a question in somebody has their hand raised. Maybe we'll take that before we move on. Kalsing, do you have a question? Oh, maybe not. Okay. So what we want to do in the last few minutes of today's workshop or conversation is present you some other methods for measuring sleep and emotion that may be more objective.
단다 nga kama khashijida dignala ya nga suge ta chiga thongya yu chu ga yu chu sakoro wa ti tang de yu chu ga susuge nywa tang man de wa che ani chiga ngyu tang shi ngyu tang de yu chu sakoro wa ta ti tang de yu chu ga tabin che de tang nga suge chi samnyong tang ani la so pa che kan das ja yu re sa ti kholen de se jagins.
In Chaktin, do you have a question?
sonda.
Tati ngada shimju ke leni do. Ani dichesala ngada tata pena shimju chede sambala pena semba do ni do san pena dawa imba da mai ba. Tindu sa jen ta shimju tamba da mobo yoro. Tindu sa ta ni andati dangala ina chis mada yong de da pena pet pesa shana da de pa. Tata dawa imba da mai ba kana che anti kana ma tatong ma cheda ma publisher ma desen chunju kala so ina. And sosoki when the Tadiliki Shimjuchi Sambala Tajik, down to the Tata Moya, the Sosoki Dagi Gola, Shuanasis in the Sosoki QMD, Pate the Kabura so the Swina, the Besan and Chigira, Dizalata, Ane Tatawa the Tawa Mindi Polani, Dantuni Niaguache, Ane Tindik and the Tawa the Tawa in the Mankala Tambani Tojili Doa, Tikorantonia Pajumazo, the Churi Dojo Laurata, Mita Yimba the Mampalata, Sambani Dosara. Down to the Tata Ramudula, down to Tata Ramudusva, and the Choni get down to the language and the down to the Tata Ragio Marta, the Lichis and Pena Peshagetara, and Tilik Kani the Siachu to the Shinjuki and the Lerin Shambaji and Chik, Yurio Maristeo, the Listio Starch.
Tachuranga Sombaina, Tampo, the Taware, Maris, Batella, the Tangasu, Injet Anshasigora.
Oh, the Tipina Dita that the page, the Dida Dina Shitali Tambo, my Bablis Repena, Mazopena, the Chunju Pena, Shatan Coronata, Kamze Inata, Penanga the Tawana, the Dazana Tawashashinura, and the Kamze Chiki that the Koron to the Kabuto Chagurata, the Tantuni Ragorata, the Shinju Chenginsa, Tantan Ragor, Tins of the Tindiki Kani Sechu, and the Shinju Lady and Tabishim Bakariana, so the Nitivachi.
All right. His question is about to get like accurate data from not a big population like this, but a small population like a Kansen or house or like small monasteries or something like that. And what are the methods to get accurate data? Because like one of the things like he has mentioned is about when you ask if you're a monastic or not, that is differentiated. From there's kind of a demarcation between a monastic or not. So there is a kind of or like their idea of a bias or something like that. There's like a differentiation in between. And also coming down to a small level, subcategories. And doing a research, we need a really clear or accurate or like good data, but it's kind of difficult to get. So
yeah, so that's what
methods?
we'll discuss next. So how about I go over some of those more objective measures,
Okay.
and then I'm happy to stay on a little bit, and then we could talk about these measures in more detail. But what we want to do finishing off here is examine exactly the question that Chaktan mentioned, which is, what are some other measures that may give us more objective metrics of sleep and emotion and self-report?
Tata disagro tata gila gila de shijagi insta din stambala nga suge ta yusugro yu shisha de tanda yu jemai ba ji yu shisha de tanga suge ne tangtu kanda ro ji length ki yu mech yo rata oti kola de shijagi ins.
Nicole, do you want to advance? So I'm going to just be pretty brief in this overview.
Tata de kola gila ge nguto dudu chichia ins.
But a very reliable measure of people's sleep patterns is what's called actigraphy.
Ta shenda chinga suge mi ge nilam ta mi ge nye ge chu ko ge ramba te trai chete chu chia chi karo sene tandangi la changu ge tok se to ga actigraphy se de pe chton kores.
And actigraphy measures very small movements which correlate very reliably to whether somebody is awake or asleep.
Ta tanda ge changu tok te de kare tase chigre se stambalaya ngasu ge nguchu chong yorwa tang nguchu chong chu koge ani dichigres tig tangtu de chigres koge tangtu de nyagres ta dig nguchu de chitang bana ngasu ge ani yapunye yu yana se yu me se chwarwa o te ta ani koge tunde yores.
Nicole, do you want to advance? So this shows you data from actigraphy across multiple days. And the yellow colored data are when a person is awake, and the blue colored data is when a person is asleep. And so this gives us very reliable data on when a person is sleeping or waking that we can use in combination with their self-report data.
Tadi dinane nga suge chiga tak serpu yochista ne chuncha serpu yochista chuncha ngombo sechtoga dige kari songore sena serpu yochitege ni seyo pickup tang ngombo chitega ni kuyo pickup sigi tangtu tangore sta tangtu de ni ma kashigrang la dus chungju toga ni ma dantro chinis grang dantro chi thas grang la nen sambala ya ta nga su kari chia yore sena tandang de la ya jangu nguchu di tayagi telaten de raju ge tangtu chiorwa dede nga chuge tangpo de la mi gernguni susu ge yara nyensa shuju ge tangtu chiorwa nyensa shuju ge susu gani nyensa shuju ge tangtu de tang ne dryers.
So we could replace people's self-report of their sleep with data on this actigraphy measure and do the same analyses where we correlate or we examine their relationships with things like emotion, well-being, health, etc.
That dins dambala nga chu mi gerganguni ge enkurnyen san siju ge trangtu chi gorwa te tak chabla ya nga chu tanda changu takthap dige teni de tan raju ge ani trangtu chi gorwa ti ge dige chapche no ge jela ani nga chu ge takhu ge ani ta ani chi samkhang ge paro la yan jawa chi du mudu sa chi gorwa o te tala yang tan de gores.
Do you want to advance the slide, Nicole? Another measure that's frequently used in sleep research is measuring a hormone called melatonin.
Ta shenda chi kare sana nga chu chi ni tang de yo chi ta sheg na tele peche ta ate kar la na nga chu ge minji peche tang gores minji de kar la na ti melatonin sa ti peche tang gores.
And melatonin is a hormone released from the pineal gland that coordinates our circadian rhythms.
The melatonin sa ti nga chu ge pineal gland sa ti ge membu to ni le ti ge kar chi la na nga chu ge minsin ju ja ge chi khondri chi gorwa o ti la tang jin chi gres.
And our circadian rhythms are our 24-hour sleep cycle.
다 단다 스크린 루틴 세팅 아주 인생 그 콘드이데 시도니 스타시기 나텔레다 아주 그 고라잔 두느게 다 지금 드리치레스.
Advance the slide. And so to study melatonin, we would have people spit into a little tube multiple times per day as they're approaching their bedtime. And we can get a measure of how quickly or at what time their biology is preparing to fall asleep.
Tadi karcia yoresana ngasu nima chiketa coach so mando kapsa tandage budina tele milaya ta kachulu dete ani koge dinalaya melatonin katsu du tagores ta teola tende ngasu ge nima tigi chitsu katsu chine miti ani niela ni kwela ya tradiching du sa chora zupu gane hotel tascha yores.
Advanced slide. So this is a figure depicting one person's slope of their melatonin as they get close to their bedtime. And we could use this slope as a metric of a person's circadian rhythm and then relate that to things like emotion, mood, health, etc.
Melatonin kansochi du sa chola shisha de ta molo katsochi du sa ti thiriji insrwa ta nga su di shisha de te ni shenda nga su ge tanda ge dela tene de ta nga su lu gi kondu gi chutsu gorwa de la ya ani chi chutsu ta nga shenda te ta ke ani shuchen kana ro chi te du de la ya taxe cha yores.
Advanced slide. And you may have heard of melatonin because some people will take a supplement called melatonin to help them fall asleep. So it's a powerful molecule to help us regulate or maintain our circadian rhythms.
Da chichina che tsuga melatonin sa de ha kujiris de nga sunya namjin ti men do tsu ta ji sa yo reswa de ka ji resana ji ni khya la phengge ro de nga suge lipu ge ji kondu ge tsu chi ro de kondu ge dre de ani ji ta ta ne la ya pen kres de chitang im bana de shu chenbo yo res.
Next slide. And then the last measure that we can use to study sleep is what is referred to as electroencephalography or EEG.
Tangaso jiga niete taxe jage talun shenda ti karesena ngaso ga letsige loresegro ati pechotang de tanya katsu kuyo me te taxe yores.
And EEG involves wearing a cap like this and recording people's brain activity while they're either awake or asleep.
Ta EEG letsige lonje de karchigaresena dira do gola koyach to de ko de tan ko niebi kasenare yamna ya lambi kapsin bana te lepage changugi kanadu chichi du te taxe chigres.
And there's very reliable brain signatures or brain profiles of brain activity that correspond to whether somebody's awake or asleep.
Then detala tene toju ge chitumdi yora de gana kari oresena ngaso te michiga ni khundu yana ni khmendu se ge tetan de oyo chuge lepa ge shangu ge tantse masuna ni tata yores de gala.
And so we can measure people's brain activity while they're sleeping with EEG and not only understand when they're asleep or not asleep, but also understand whether or when they're in certain stages of sleep.
Tatanda so EEG so let's go lorti let's go longe de pechutang de tanga so michi katuni kusha ani kasogre katu sesha se titsam katuni kusha katu sesha se titsam mamba koge ani niebi kapsa ni kupi kapsa imbana ani la yang ramba mangpu yoro ati kawa kola ledu se te top cres.
And one of the things that's been reported is that people who are really sad or depressed, they may differ or they may not differ on self-report, but it has been found that their brains look slightly different when they're sleeping as measured by EEG, and that has important implications for understanding their depression.
Descendanga su semla ya yimu kina sayong juton tena do imbana chitanga susu gargang uni ge nyensan shiju ge tang to telaya chi chepa shita meba imbana ya tadanga su ge let's ge lokshi chorwa delate baina yanko ge cheperte ngoyong yores chepra ngoyong ba telatene deta yang milaya samnge yuchu tang yishimba gi samnge yuchu tang tena do imbana deta yang chuko ngachu hakwa tang toela ya pengyores.
And when we're in India doing the research workshop with you, we will be spending a lot of time teaching you how to use EEG, and we're going to be bringing EEG systems over to India and training you in these techniques so you can measure brain activity, not only while people are sleeping, but also measure brain activity while people are awake.
Tanda nga so de taksegi subjon de ta thigro thig kap simbana nga so tanda EEG se tanda electrical orange gi yuchi de suma thichi de pa jaga kyong de tang ne chetsula ne de takana do chi pechu tang ge merwa ti pechu tang thap ti de jagin tene chetsu karchine digresena ane ni khya tang ni ma khya ta kagi kap simbana yang lepa gi chi jeli ti kana do chi gu de lepa gi chegu ti kana do chi du se te ta la ya chetsu taksina na digres.
For example, there's been a fair amount of research that's looked at the relationship between people's experience in training and meditation and their profiles of brain activity as measured by EEG. And we can examine that when we help train you in these methods of EEG.
Jela nga so de kola desijab de kandas to taksi jigu yo metin desijade tan chetsuti gala ya taksenana de kores.
So speaking of sleep, we're aware of the fact that it's getting pretty late over there in India, and we've gone a few minutes over. So that will be the end of our presentation tonight or today. I'll just say for myself, and then Nicole, you can say something, but I hope that you learned a little bit about your sleep and your mood and realized that there's many more questions to ask than there are answers that we have at the moment.
Tatanda imbaina ngaso enye kolan decisions tambalaya ane jagalaya tis chucha ta chi nyeg chile yesigdes tanda ngaso chiso tis chi yeshaswa imbaina yang tanda yang chi tanda ngaso dus dulan chions tambalaya ngaso ge ta len jaba li mawa chirwa ne topal he chi toa tria ge ne tanda ma pu chang dus tambalaya jimala protetala ki len detga girwa yes.
And we're happy to stay on for a little bit if you have any questions. And we'll also each type our emails into the chat, and you're always welcome to contact us with questions or things that we can help with.
Tatanda gela ge email ti tanda ti chentong kursa tina kursagin skete chetsula ya draw yo pa ina ro jila ne draw do ta ro pa chi go pa ne gela katina tus na digres ro tanda chetsula kete ne draw do yo pa ina gela ni tis jugin ne draw tanga de yes.
Thank you so much, everybody. We look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon.
Great to be with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole and Robin and Dawa.
Thank you, all
so
of
much.
you. It's very
Thank you all.